Welcome to a bonus edition of Shadow Talk. Today, Dr. Richard Gold joins me to discuss the recent BBC Russian service investigation into Facebook accounts being sold online. As reported on Friday, at least 81,000 accounts with private messages were being advertised online. Richard and I will outline what we know so far, as well as answering some of the key questions raised by this story. Hello listeners, as I said in my introduction, we've got an impromptu edition of the podcast today, but we'll be focusing on another security story affecting Facebook. Joining me is Dr. Richard Gold, Head of Security Engineering. Hi Richard.
Hi Rafa, how are you doing?
Very good, very good. Still recovering from all the hecticness on Friday.
Get in there.
Now, on Friday, the BBC published a story following a BBC Russian service investigation into how threat actors had compromised and published private messages from at least 81,000 Facebook users' accounts. Digital Shadows actually assisted the BBC with this investigation, with Richard spearheading the effort to verify and unpack the data in question. So, you're in good hands. For those who haven't already checked it out, we have a blog up on the Digital Shadows website that provides an overview of the dataset and the key things you need to know. A link is available in the description of this podcast. We'll of course cover all of these points and more in today's show. So first things first, Richard, there's a bit of confusion. There's a lot of different figures being bandied about. How many accounts are affected?
So what we've seen so far is that there's about 250,000 accounts referenced in this breach. And I think the key point that gets a lot of people interested is that about 81,000 of them have the private messages included. So that's all of the Facebook Messenger chat that these people exchanged with others.
And as well as private messages, what other type of information or data is out there with these accounts?
There's personal information too, the biographical information, so name, location, that kind of thing, and also references to the photos. But the photos didn't appear to be part of this breach, or at least in the way that I was able to see from the data that I was provided with.
And if you have that profile information of the names, the location, likes, dislikes, does that mean also you have access to your friendship network as well?
That's not really part of the breach as we see today. However, the biographical information would definitely be useful for security questions. So when you want to gain access to another site and it asks, where do you live, what town did you grow up in, this kind of thing, then that information would be there.
So we'll cover what this means for users and the different uses of this type of data a bit later on. Going back to these profiles and the accounts, are they generally from a particular region?
Yeah, so the majority of the accounts were from Ukraine, so about 30% of the profiles that we saw. And the next biggest geography was Russia with about 9%, but many other countries, at least US, UK, Brazil, etc., are represented in the breach.
Do you think that so many were based in Ukraine? Is that significant?
It's very difficult to say. It could be for a number of reasons. It could be specific targeting. It's probably the natural one that we tend to jump to, right? But as we like to ascribe intent to these kind of things. However, it could also be for other reasons. So we'll probably talk about this a little bit more, but Facebook attribute this leak of data from a malicious browser extension. Now, if that malicious browser extension was one that was very popular in that region, then you would expect to see the geographical distribution that we saw.
And about this browser extension, I've been looking at Facebook's response. It's still quite vague. I think it's more of a holding statement at the minute, and they said they're going to provide more information later on. Do you have anything else to say about the methods that might have been used here?
Yeah, so I think one of the interesting things is that it's quite a lot of accounts. So although the attackers claim that they have access to 120 million accounts, I think that that's a stretch. But still, 250,000 accounts, so a lot of accounts, and the 81,000 which have private messages, that's significant. So in order to get that amount of data out of a platform such as Facebook, who really don't want you to have that kind of data, then you have to have some way of targeting the users. And that looks to me like why a browser extension is a good candidate for that. Things like account takeover through either stolen passwords or guessed passwords will definitely get you quite a lot. But in terms of this sort of industrial mass scale, tens and tens of thousands of accounts, then I think that a browser extension is a good candidate.
And one thing you were saying to me last week was with so many thousands, I mean, we're talking about hundreds of thousands of accounts here, being compromised, you think that something on that sort of scale would be very unlikely that that would have gone unnoticed with Facebook. So if it is a browser extension, the insinuation there is that it's sort of on the user side, on the customer side, so kind of outside of Facebook's visibility.
Right, exactly. So, I mean, they can see things like anomalous behavior in terms of, for example, attempts to scrape things and that kind of stuff. So they could potentially pick up that type of anomalous behavior. But yeah, in terms of getting things at this scale, it's difficult for them when it's something which is exclusively residing on the user's machine and can just pick up whatever the browser sees whenever they click through their photos, their private messages. I would assume, and this is an assumption, that the browser extension would have waited for them to authenticate to Facebook and then done some scraping. So that scraping behavior could be something that they detected, and maybe they did detect. But still, 250,000 profiles out of the over 2 billion active users they apparently have could easily go undetected.
And going to the claims of the particular actor advertising these accounts, so these accounts were being sold or at least advertised on a forum known as SEO, or an SEO forum called Blackhat World. And in the actual advertisement, the threat actor or the seller was basically saying that they had a lot more accounts available. And what we've seen is apparently just a sample of that data. Now, what do you have to say on this threat actor and the claims that they're making?
Well, for a start, I think we decided that Blackhat SEO forum, this one seemed like a bit of an odd place to be selling this kind of data if you really had that kind of data. Typically, you'd expect to see that in a closed group amongst people who trust each other, who know each other well. However, I would say that 120 million, we're talking then 5% of Facebook's active user base. I think that's too much to have been scraped without triggering some kinds of alarms inside of Facebook itself. I think the 250,000 that we've seen, yeah, I could see how that could happen. But there's such a big gap between 250,000 and 120 million. I mean, it stretches the credibility, I think, of these guys.
Yeah, and as you said, Blackhat SEO is an unusual forum for this type of activity in a way. I mean, it's an online forum primarily used for sharing tips and tools on how to do better search engine optimization, boost marketing techniques. I mean, there is a bit of a malicious side to it as well, because some of this is a grey area in terms of some of the tools that are shared.
Definitely.
So the types of goods that are generally sold there are things like proxies, old social media accounts, web hosting services.
It's definitely the more dodgy side of the internet, that's for sure.
Yeah, but given that and what you've said, what do you think the intentions of the actors behind this were?
Money? I think it's pretty straight up from my side. They found a way to get a bunch of accounts, and now they packaged it all up. And the interesting thing as well with this breach is that the data is in quite an easy to navigate format. You can load it into your web browser and browse around as if you were navigating a very old version of Facebook. So it's not just raw data, raw CSV or SQL or something like this. It's, something that is a bit more user-friendly. And I think that they could have intentionally distributed a malicious extension, or they could have bought an existing extension with an install base and hijacked that. That's something that we've seen before. And I think they realized that they had good access to these accounts and now want to make some money out of it. I don't think there's much more behind it than that. I would imagine, I could be wrong of course, but I would imagine that this is more an opportunistic approach.
I guess one thing that strengthens that is the fact that the data set, or at least what you saw, was the title of it was a reference to the Cambridge Analytica
Right.
controversy. Now, I guess this feeds into the whole reason why stories such as this are big in the news as well. Anytime we hear anything to do with security and Facebook, people immediately jump to connections with Cambridge Analytica. Have you seen anything to suggest that this data set is connected to that controversy?
No. The timing doesn't fit. the geography doesn't fit. I think it's a deliberate red herring on behalf of the sellers in order to get more attention and make some more money.
And it's probably worth highlighting as well that there was also a story in September about a bug that allowed attackers to steal access tokens of Facebook users. Again, would you say that there's no correlation here with what you've seen?
There's no correlation that I can see. Again, that particular issue was related to, as you mentioned, the access tokens, and that gave the attackers access to some information, but I didn't see anything in the open source reporting that indicated that private messages were part of this.
So on these private messages, what does this mean for users? The fact that this has occurred and these accounts are available online.
Well, I think the thing to really keep in mind is that if you're using a platform like Facebook, which doesn't have end-to-end encryption in terms of the messaging, then the data that you put there will be visible to the platform itself and associated, in this case, extensions or apps or third parties potentially. So it's quite interesting actually, because Facebook also owned WhatsApp, and WhatsApp used the end-to-end encryption protocols from Signal, which is very strong and something that we in the security engineering team are big fans of, highly recommend. So there is almost a little bit of schizophrenia there between the approaches, but the thing to really keep in mind is that if the platform doesn't use end-to-end encryption, then those messages, that information you put there, is available.
And you said it in a couple of your media interviews. If you think about the type of information that would be shared over private messages, you can imagine people will share bank details, saying, "Oh, just send money to my account, give you the sort code." People share maybe sensitive scans of particular documents that they have, or just generally sensitive or private communications that you have with other people. That's all now available to people.
Definitely, and I think that's what makes it quite concerning as these breaches go, is people may have this expectation of privacy, of security from using private messenger. Then it feels like it's a one-to-one personal communication, but it really isn't. And I think one of the things maybe that can come out of this is that increased awareness on behalf of the public that there is a difference between end-to-end encryption and these platforms which do allow you to store the information in plain text inside of their platform.
So as well as being more mindful about privacy and what you do share online and what channels you use to share that information and data, what other things should people be doing as a result of this story?
Well, once again, we've seen that browser extensions are quite a nice attack vector for adversaries out there, especially this trick of buying up an extension which has an existing install base and then repurposing that for malicious purposes. So that's definitely something to be concerned about. So obviously, being careful about which extensions you choose means that you can hopefully minimize the chances that the extensions that you're using will get hijacked by malicious third parties. But of course, you never know. And it may be the case that even with the best will in the world, it may be the fact that the extension is taken over, is basically hacked into, that install base is then repurposed by the attackers, but they didn't buy it, they just hacked in, stole the credentials to push out a malicious update, or so on. So, keeping an eye on the news, making sure that the things that you use, if they show up in the news, it's worth going back and checking to see where you have them installed and uninstalling them if necessary.
And what about some of the traditional advice we give regarding account takeovers? Did that type of practice also be applicable here?
Yeah, that still holds, absolutely. Having unique passwords for each of the websites that you use, different passwords for your Facebook, your PayPal, your Amazon, that's still very good advice. Making sure those passwords are not easy to guess is also very good advice. So that way, that if somebody does hack into, for example, your Facebook or gets hold of your Facebook account password in some way, they can't use that password to do anything else. So it limits the impact. That's very, very good. And if possible, everyone, I appreciate it's a bit of a speed bump, but two-factor authentication. it's such a strong control. It's such a strong control that I can give you my password and you can't log in as me. And that's why we recommend it so strongly.
I think we've hit all the main points there. So thank you for joining us for this bonus edition of Shadow Talk. We'll be back on Friday with normal service. Have a good week.